Sorry for the delay. We were having a shootout in the back, and the justice won. So we saw a cowboy western on the Upper East Side of New York with the Supreme Court Justice. Justice Breyer, welcome to the Forum Film Festival at the 92nd Street Y. When I first reached out to you to do this, I think I offered you a number of films. You immediately jumped at The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Does the film have a special resonance with you? Does it evoke something in your past, or do you remember it at different... the cowboy past of yours.
Yeah, I did hear you say that. But first, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this. I mean, what a great chance for me to see this film and to be here. It's really nice of you. I think it's such a good idea. For me, anyway. And actually, it isn't true that I was engaged in cattle rustling. It is true I grew up in the West. I grew up in San Francisco. My family's from there. San Francisco is not quite your normal, it's not the OK Corral.
Yeah, but you and your brother were Eagle Scouts. I had that right.
Well, the closest we came to the buffalo was when I had a job one summer working with the PG&E in the yards or something, and when I was in high school, and the man who was with me about my age, who taught me a couple of things, he said, first, when the superintendent comes to the foreman, you've got to hide. And then the second thing he said, he came in one day, he was quite pleased because he said in Golden Gate Park, they used to keep buffalo, the bison. And he announced that he and some friends of his, who I think had a little bit too much to drink, had gone there and freed all the buffalo. They'd let them out and said, free the buffalo, give us back our lands. You see, so that's as close as I came.
But in the spirit of this film, I just had to elevate the legend of your Western expansion.
I see, that's right. That
gave you a full cowboy
Yeah,
history.
I did used to go to camp, that's right.
So tell us why you like the film. You helped me select
it. Oh, it's a fabulous film. I mean, just look at it. I mean, my gosh. I used to think, well, I explained to myself, this is not a political comment. But I thought, it's filled with irony and interest. It's about legends. Well, what's the legend? You see in the film, I thought, well, now I understand Ronald Reagan a lot better, actually.
Yes.
And it's truthful.
Yeah.
Why? Because the first thing is there's a whole mystique in America. Look, one thing is you can't just talk. You talk too much. You think too much. That's not against talking and thinking. It's just that this film says underneath that, you better be prepared to use force when you have to. Because if people are bad enough, you've got to shoot them. Now, you say, well, do we think that? Gosh. I don't think that. But the Greeks did, didn't they?
Yes.
And you go back to the Iliad, it's not till after the Iliad, when they get back to Greece, and they're pursued by the Furies. Eventually, we end up in Athens. Eventually, they say, it's my city, says Athena, the god of justice. Very late in the day, because they first had to drive back the wilderness. You say, do any of us believe that? Well, how do you feel about President Eisenhower sending those 1,000 paratroopers to Little Rock? When I hear that he made that decision, when I hear that Jimmy Burns, his counselor from North Carolina, and not really racist, South Carolina, the governor, said, if you send those troops to help those black children get into the school, you'd better be prepared to have a second Reconstruction. But he did it. He put the 1,000 troops, the paratroopers, onto the plains. And they went to Little Rock, and they helped the children into the school. Now, where do we draw this line? Because the judges couldn't have done that by themselves. You could have had 9,000 judges ordering integration in the South, but it took more than that. And I usually say when I talk about this to judges from Africa or Asia, I say you've got to have the people with you. You do have to have the people with you. It did take the Freedom Riders. It did take Martin Luther King. But it certainly didn't just take lawyers and judges. My goodness. So you say, what's in this? There's another thing from the West, which is part of our legend. There are those who talk, and there are those who act. And the ones who act don't do it for credit. They don't do it to get the credit. Give the other ones the credit. My goodness, he must have been filled with irony, Ford. Because who symbolizes that? John Wayne.
Right.
But who is it who joined the armed forces in World War II?
Jimmy Stewart.
Not John Wayne.
Not John Wayne.
But Ford did. See the experience he's coming out of? He's coming out of fighting Hitler.
Yeah.
He's coming out of fighting some awfully bad people. And doesn't that make you ask these questions? We're for law, we're not for force. But wait, there is the shield of Achilles. There is the need to drive back those terrible, unmanageable forces that made up the wilderness. And that's why I like these Westerns. These Westerns, Shane, even Stagecoach, Red River. I mean, my goodness,
Searchers.
they're telling a story that's part of the United States, and it's part of how the United States, which of course, how wonderful that school seemed to me, where they talk about democracy being at the bottom of this. And you see those people get the point. They get the point. That required a lot. And all of the mixture, all of the difficulties, all of our own ironies, all of our own understanding that civilization is a lot more than lawyers and law. I mean, I usually point out that of the 311 million people in the United States, 310 million are not judges and they're not lawyers. And they're the ones that have to understand the need for the rule of law. And this just tells us something. Going way back, I think back to the Greeks, but I already said that. It's interesting.
The Greeks, for those of you, this is like, first of all, how cool was that? Name a film festival that does that, for the love of God. That was great, thank you. But for those of you who are following at home, you were talking about Aeschylus's The Oresteia trilogy.
Yeah,
right?
coming after the Iliad.
When he talks about the Greeks, you can go home and do this on your own, Google it. It's the Aeschylus's The Oresteia trilogy, and it really is the first recorded trial in Western civilization when the goddess Athena says, let's not let the Furies try to, seek vengeance on Orestes for killing his mother, and let's have a trial. And then, of course, the trial so dramatic of the Greeks was deadlocked, and she breaks the tie, and we have our first jury trial.
That's true.
It's really...
That's true.
So thank you. I love how you tie that together. So there's so much that you just said that's so interesting. One thought is that you need the gun, and you also need the law book in some ways. You need both. And it's interesting because the way the film plays out, what are we supposed to think at the end? That what gets you to Washington and the Court of St. James, was it the book or the gun? Because it's such I just for the first time realized that scene could have been done differently. We don't see in the movie the scene when they're deliberating whether they can send Jimmy Stewart, Rance, to Washington with sort of blood on his hands, right? A gunfighter, right? We don't know what they were deliberating on. Now, obviously, they won out that the fact that he shot Liberty Valance showed a certain Western manliness, and he's perfectly acceptable as a delegate. But, it could have been reversed, that they decided we don't send a man who's a killer, and John Wayne needs to then come in and say, oh, wait a minute, he's not the killer, I'm the killer. And it's very interestingly American, because it says, no, we're willing to let the gunfighter represent us. When you said Ronald Reagan, I thought, yeah, we want that guy. We want the heroic guy. We want the Gipper.
No, I'm not saying that Ronald Reagan is a reincarnation of John Wayne.
Right. No, I know that.
True. I'm saying there's a part of civilized life that understands that this civilized life is a result of a struggle. It doesn't mean we all go out and get guns. It means that if you go back to the history of civilization, there was a time when people had to conquer the wilderness, and then there's a time, if you say, is it still necessary to conquer? Everyone has some pretty dark emotions some of the time. And so he's tapped into a struggle that exists, I think, within individual people, within societies. You have to fight, and that doesn't mean going and killing people, but it means that ordinary people who aren't lawyers, who aren't judges, who aren't necessarily, they're all kinds of different professions, but they have to understand the difficulty of maintaining civilized, law-abiding, democratic society. Maybe today it involves no more than going to the polls. Maybe it means you make sure people can go. Maybe it means they understand their obligation to participate.
But that's in the movie too, which is something I hadn't thought about before, right? I mean, the film is really about civilizing the West in many ways. They have educating the West now, and then you see the town hall meeting, participatory democracy. Like, they're introducing the civilizing elements of the social contract in one movie. You get a whole bunch of things. You can't use the gun, you need the law books, you really should learn to read. There was one scene that I totally forgot, the bit in the restaurant when Peabody tells her which way to put the fork and the knife, and she doesn't care.
Because she's not literate.
She's not literate, and she doesn't care.
And that's why she admires the person who talks and thinks.
Exactly.
But he isn't the most admirable person. He is an admirable person, but not necessarily the most admirable person. And it's not necessarily, you forget too, that Ford brings it up. Lincoln. What was Lincoln doing? He was presiding over the most terrible, bloody Civil War in history. What was going on in this country? You see? It was a terrible war. And Joanna's just been reading, The Rivals.
Your wife.
Yeah. And she pointed something out to me, which everyone knows this, but I hadn't focused on it. And that is, why is it that we hear that Lincoln said he would have fought the Civil War, even if no one was freed? He would have fought it if half the slaves were freed. He would have fought it if all the slaves were freed. But was that exaggeration? What was he talking about? And then he says at the beginning of the Gettysburg Address, how many times we've heard that, and yet I'd never really focused on it. He says, 77 years ago, what happened? I ask students at the court when they come, what happened 70 years ago? 50% say the Constitution. No, that's not right. It's the Declaration of Independence. Why the Declaration of Independence? Because that's the document that says all men are created equal. So what Lincoln says at Gettysburg is, he says, 77 years ago, our forefathers came forth upon this continent to create a new nation dedicated to the proposition. Joanna, what is it?
Yeah. Joanna.
What? She's going to forget too. Based on the proposition and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. What is it? See, I forgot.
Anyone else?
What?
Conceived in liberty.
Thank you very much. Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And we are now engaged in a great war to see if a nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. And what he's saying right there is, we are an experiment. Thomas Jefferson knew we are an experiment. Abraham Lincoln knew we are an experiment every day. But then it was the only nation so conceived and so dedicated. Proposition, democracy. And John Wayne is saying an awful lot goes into that battle. Much goes into the battle. He had just come out of World War II. We're 5, that's a great book. Read the book, 5 came back.
Yeah.
Read the book about those 5 directors who went over in World War II. So it may take different forms. It may exist in different ways, but it isn't going to be judges and lawyers who will save democracy in the United States. So when I see that and I want to go writ large, I say, that's what he's telling me. Thank you, John Ford.
So Hallie chooses Rance over Tom, and that isn't how it normally is in American movies. In American movies, we don't pick the person who's the brainy intellectual. We pick the brawny character. And it does, interesting, and film is in 1962, so all of those earlier motifs of how American movies are supposed to end, there's so many interesting pieces to that. But, you know, it does seem to point to this idea that this is a film that's driving home what civilization looks like, what it should look like, what progress will look like. It's important to keep in mind, since Justice Breyer mentioned the Civil War, the movie takes place in 1875. So it's really only it's only 15 years, a decade after the end of the Civil War, which gives you another sense when Pompey comes into the bar and he says, "Pour him a drink." First of all, I thought even in 1962 in the South, in the Deep South, people must have hated that scene. But that's a very powerful scene. In 1875, again, in the territories, they said, "Give him a drink."
Yes.
And again, it does seem like everything is pointing towards civilization, that even the guy who gets the girl at the end will be he'll be a hero, but he'll look different than a more conventional hero. So we're learning about 19th century frontier justice in this film. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about, you know, when they say things in the beginning like, out here, a man settles his own problems. Great line. Liberty Valance says, "I'll teach you the law, Western style." And it's interesting because, you know, there was very little justice that took place in the Wild West. That's why they called it the Wild West. Posses, right? I mean, these are all interesting. It's interesting to think about what law looked like in America in the 19th century in the West, right? For instance, the posse comitatus. Maybe you can explain to everyone where we got the word circuit judges.
Because the judges used to ride around on a horse in a circle. I always thought they went from one town to another, and that was the circuit. That comes from England, really.
Right, but I mean, here they really meant it, because the towns didn't have local jurists, and the judges were on horses. And when you convened a posse, the people were basically taking on the role of law enforcement on their own. And then if they didn't hang the defendant, they would keep him in a prison and wait till the judge comes to town on his horse.
It's not just the West. I mean, go back in history, and you think of the great literature in history is often battles. The Iliad is a battle.
Yep.
And you think there's still nothing. We admire that. That is, a reader or a watcher, when you see the scenes with Lee Marvin and with John Wayne, there are heroes, there are good guys, and there are bad guys. And so this is interesting because we want to transcend that kind of ethic. But he's not saying it's bad.
Right.
Any more than Achilles or Hector or any of the heroes in the books of history are bad. It's just passing from that stage and trying to civilize. And there it is. I'd be repeating what you've already said and others,
I was thinking about, and I know this is sacrilege for a Supreme Court justice to even think about, but, you know, is there a virtue in this taking justice into one's own hands? There's a certain finality to it, a certainty. You know, people complain all the time about the bureaucracy of law, how long things take. People have to wait for appeals and remands, and, you know, and then there's all the possibility of, you know, constitutional irregularities, Fourth Amendment challenges, where guilty people go free. You know, this movie reminds us about, oh, let's hang them, let's string them up, right? That this was, you know, obviously there's incredible miscarriages of justice, but you can almost see the appeal of the revenge film, where the law either fails or doesn't do its job, and justice has to be done in some way. It becomes morally intolerable, right? That's the other John Ford film, the John Wayne, The Searchers, right? An entire film based on chasing after to do what's just, to right a wrong, even though it's...
If you're thinking of taking law into your own hands, my advice would be don't.
So nobody...
And I would say, of course, I am a judge. And of course, we don't live in the Old West. And we aren't in circumstances that they were in the Searchers. And therefore, and I'm dedicated, as those who are in the law and many who are not, to the law. And indeed, there are injustices, that's true. But often when people take law into their own hands, they produce a worse situation. So what I try to explain to the law students is I say, I'll give you a perfect example. And this is true of our court. Our court sometimes overturns laws of Congress. We're 9 human beings. Being human, we make mistakes. I say, you pick out the case you want. When Hamilton decided that our court should have the power to overturn a law of Congress, that was quite a major decision, and he and the founders did decide that. It wasn't just John Marshall. Well, why should a group of 9 people who are not elected, why should they have the power to overturn a law elected by people who were passed by people who are elected? Well, Hamilton explains it, and he says because maybe those people who are elected will not apply this document, the Constitution, quite as it was intended. They'll do everything fine as long as it's popular, but the Constitution is for the least popular person as well as the most. And I'm not so sure how they'll behave when the person is unpopular or belongs to a minority. Therefore, we call in the judges. But he never said, why would people follow the judges? Would they follow them? So I take to the students, I say, what do you think about Bush v. Gore? I said, yeah, I know what you think. You don't have to tell me. I said, that is a very good example. It is an example. Why? Because it's an important decision. It was an unpopular decision, at least with half the country, and then I usually add maybe a few more than half, but none. And in my opinion, since I wrote a dissent, it was wrong. All right? I thought it was wrong, unpopular, and important. But one of the most interesting remarks I've heard about it was Harry Reid, who said the most interesting feature of the case is very rarely noted, despite the unpopularity, despite the fact that it was wrong, in my opinion, and its importance. There were no riots. There were not people shot in the streets. There were not people throwing stones at the other. And that is a tremendous virtue of our system. Therefore, what? I then say to my student audience, I know perfectly well when I say that at least 20% of you are sitting there thinking, and too bad there weren't a few bricks and stones and maybe a few guns and riots. Too bad. I say, that's what you're thinking. So go turn on the television set and you go and see what happens in countries that solve their differences that way. Yes, exactly, exactly. And then see if you do not see something to a system where I don't get my way all the time, nor does anybody else. And I moved to Washington from San Francisco and Boston, and I'd seen disagreements, in San Francisco and Boston, but nothing till I got on the Supreme Court in Washington. I mean, people really do come from different backgrounds. They do have different basic views of law and how the Constitution works, and I thought that was really a pity. I wish they'd agree with me all the time. But that's not how it works. And it's a big country, and people think a lot of different things. So, of course, I'm dedicated to that proposition. But and here, when I see the roots of it, fine. That's true. That's what people have tried to rise above. And John Wayne knows that. And he's a good man, John Wayne.
Yeah, he is.
He's a good man in that movie.
Now, but this movie and other Westerns all have this sort of romantic notion that just desserts must be achieved in some way, right? For instance, there's that scene when Liberty Valance is killed and the doctor examines him and says dead, because they want him dead.
Yeah.
They believe that this
Well, that's
guy,
hardly surprising.
right, of course. They think this is the one guy that nobody's going to shed a tear over. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, that kind of the righteousness that comes from the cowboy western where just desserts is delivered at some point in the film, how do you respond to students, to people that greet you on the street when they say, sometimes legal decisions make no sense, they seem unjust, maybe it's Bush v. Gore, and it's very hard to live with these decisions by our jurists. I don't understand what the jury was thinking. People say that about the OJ trial. How come nobody understands what reasonable doubt means, right? Casey Anthony, right? We hear this and people sort of throw their arms up and say there's no justice. And how do you
That seems like a slight overstatement.
All right, well,
I'd say that, well, yes, that's true. that there are things that seem to be wrong, and they're true in every system. And of course, we get fed up, and of course, you get angry at this or annoyed at that. But I so many times, I say, okay, you don't like what this is going on over here. If you say go outside the justice system for a minute, that's why you have a vote. That's why you have a brain, and you can write, and you can read, and you can convince others of your point of view. That's a very simple point. But it's reassuring to many people to think that if I don't agree with what's going on, I can get out and organize and convince others there is a system that basically works. It doesn't always work perfectly, of course not. Nor does the justice system always work perfectly by any means. And yet, the fair trial, though it sometimes means a guilty person will get off, I like to say, you know, when there's a terrible crime, something should happen. But one thing that shouldn't happen is that you punish a person who didn't do it. And we have a system, imperfect though it is, that tries to see that that doesn't happen, that tries to see that there are safeguards. So be impatient, fine, then try to improve it, fine. But I haven't seen good alternatives, because taking justice into your own hands often means no justice at all.
Right. I mean, yet these films are an artifact very much of a 19th century way of thinking.
We did fight a civil war,
right,
in order to end a terrible injustice. We did go through 80 years of legal segregation. And to end that took far more than just a group of judges.
Right.
It took, in addition, presidents who were dedicated to trying to do it, and it took, in addition, the Freedom Riders and Martin Luther King, and a great mobilization of opinion. And still it's imperfect. But change like that doesn't come about easily. All right, I guess the point is that the system is not a perfect system. And everyone understands that. And that doesn't mean that you produce chaos as the result.
Good. Cowboy westerns and legal dramas seem to share, in some ways, a kind of American cultural ethos. I heard it again here today, you know, the word hired gun was invoked in the film, and often lawyers are called hired guns. The idea of the dramatic confrontation of dueling and the trial, right?
Yes.
Summations to the jury, right? That very dramatic closing moment. And you can see why cowboy westerns, in a way, and legal dramas have been so irresistible to artists, because they offer that similar dramatic tension. But you know, when I was a kid, there was Gunsmoke, and there was Perry Mason, and there was
The Shadow.
Right, The Shadow. There was, my favorite one was The Defenders. I love that one. And then, of course, there was Bonanza. Bonanza never made sense to me. There were like 3 Jews in Colorado, one of whom was an Orthodox Jew. I don't understand that one. But anyway, But one thing that I've noticed is that we have a proliferation of legal dramas, right, from L.A. Law on. But we don't see westerns anymore. Does that make you think? I mean, you know, we have The Good Wife. We don't have The Good Frontier's Wife. Why do you think that's true? Do you think I was thinking of this only because you said that we've you know, maybe these are truly the workings of the civilizing impulse, that we don't recognize that 19th century gunfighter in us anymore.
It isn't the 19th century gunfighter, but I think there is something of a change, and it's not all. One thing that made an impression on me once, which I took my children, I was driving across the country in a Jeep, which unfortunately my son left the top and all the windows somewhere by the side of the road. I don't know where he left it, but we were going with the Jeep alone, and we went across the country. One of the most interesting places that we saw was in South Dakota, or Wyoming, northern part of Wyoming. You can go to a place where you look at the rock, and in the rock there are the wagon ruts carved by the wagons going across the overland trail to Oregon, up to the Oregon Trail. And it says there when they passed. They were passing in the 1830s, even 1840s. Now, not very far away is the point where that golden spike was driven in the late 1860s when the railroads spanned the continent. So what people are thinking 10, 20, 30 years later at the end of the century and a little after is that we took this continent that was, they don't care about, you know, they don't care about the Indians. I think they should have, perhaps, but they didn't, and not much anyway. And they took this wilderness, but they civilized it. They tamed it, which had its good as well as its bad. But then you look at Mount Rushmore, and you see maybe they're thinking, my imagination says that what they're thinking is in Europe, they took their heroes and put them on statues in the middle of the town. But in America, we carve our heroes into mountains. And if you think they're not thinking it's something like that, go look at the Smithsonian building built in the late 19th century, and the reading room at the Library of Congress, and the Panama Canal, and the fort that was built around the Panama Canal, the Army base. And what you see there is this tremendous, to me anyway, I see it as tremendous optimism. This tremendous optimism after these enormous feats of engineering, of business, of law too, and even of democracy, and the end of slavery, and the beginnings of, well, I mean, you see this all happening, and there we have an optimistic America, particularly after World War II, when we beat these very, very bad guys, very bad indeed. And now I think maybe the Western is appealing to something there. And maybe we're just a little pessimistic, maybe a little too pessimistic at the moment.
The signature line from this movie that's considered in the AFA, American Film Institute's list of 100 greatest movie lines, which is the iconic, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. It's a great line, fabulous, but it's really cynical. And it makes you think that truth doesn't matter, that we're actually buying into a premise that when it comes to the press, the truth doesn't matter. And even when it comes to the law, that the law isn't a great truth seeker or truth teller, that in the end we have findings of fact, and not everybody necessarily agrees on those facts, and it's hard to know what the truth is. And so, you leave people with this sort of ambiguity about truth. And in some ways, it's a great line, but it's an unsatisfying line, because it makes us think that, well, truth won't really matter if you just create a legend of Justice Breyer the cowboy. Eventually people will believe it. If you say it long enough, when it becomes the fact, print it.
He doesn't believe that, John Ford. He just says that because he wants to get a dig in at the press. And he had come out of the World War II experience where he and it was, I guess, George Stevens and Capra.
Yeah, all of them.
Houston, and who was the other one? Yeah, William Wyler.
Right.
Exactly. And they'd been working for the propaganda section. And they had a terribly hard time getting anything through. They produced things they thought were pretty good, and they had to deal with this machinery up there, which was printing legends, and it didn't necessarily want the whole truth. So when I saw that, I thought, what do you mean, print the legend? He's just told us the truth. I mean,
yeah, but look at how the movie ends, right? I mean, the movie is such a fine ending, because he told us the truth, but the newspaper publisher doesn't want to publish it. And within 15 or 20 minutes, he's reminded why he's really famous. It's not for his 3 terms as governor. It's not for his 2 or 3 terms as senator. It's not for his years in England. It's for being the man who shot Liberty Valance. And so he's a prisoner of this myth-making. He's become his own caricature of this heroic American that helped tame the West, not with books, but with a really puny gun. Also, it's funny, you think about it, I was watching it this time with 2 U.S. Marshals in the green room. I mean, today we wouldn't do, CSI, the forensics on this was ridiculous. The shot's over here, the bullet is a shotgun versus a tiny gun. No one ever thought, wait a minute, let's reassess let's get to the crime scene investigation. This was such a classic one for Dexter. All right. Let's take some questions from the audience, and then we'll say goodnight to our friend Justice Breyer. The first one, I don't know whether to answer it, but I'm going to ask it because it came from the audience. Are there any benefits arising at all from Citizens United?
Well, that people will work hard to figure out some other way, and there are perhaps other ways of dealing with this campaign finance problem. I haven't found too many yet, but you never know. Yeah.
Do you think that the Supreme Court justices maintain a higher public profile today than they did 25 years ago? If so, and why? And it's not just because, we had Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor was at the film festival a few years ago. We showed the film 12 Angry Men. And it's not just because of the film festival. I think there's a sense that you guys are out in the world more than that had been in your predecessor brethren.
You think I have a high profile? I don't know. I don't want to count. I get sometimes this question.
Do you get recognized in public?
That's exactly the question I get.
But you go to a
not
restaurant?
Not very often. They say sometimes. Sometimes I say when I'm in Washington, I will go into a restaurant and somebody looks at me as if he recognizes me, seems to recognize. He comes up and asks me a question. It's always the same question. You know the question?
No.
Aren't you Justice Souter?
And you say yes.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, if you walked around with your robe, would they ask you more? No, you're out of place. You look very dapper, nice tie, but I'm not placing you, and maybe we need we did a forum event years ago with journalists who cover the law, and one of the journalists who now is a CBS legal affairs correspondent, Janet Crawford, right? Jan Crawford, I can't remember. Yeah. Very sweet woman. She told the story about Justice, was it Brennan, who was taking a breath of fresh air, went out to the front steps of the Supreme Court, and he just wanted to get some sun and some air. And he stood out there and he was getting some sun. And then some people came up with a camera and they said, they pointed at him. And then they told him to move this way. And he moved this way. And then they took focused and they told him to move that way. And then he moved that way. And then they said, can you get out of the way? Because it was the family they were shooting. They didn't know that he was the Supreme Court justice. They were just trying to get him out of the way.
That's all right. That's normal. And there is a good and a bad. I would say if people take a greater interest in what the court actually does, and if, in fact, when Justice Sotomayor, as she does when she speaks, I speak, we all speak to law school audiences, other audiences, try to explain what we do, that we're unanimous 50% of the time, that the 5-4s are about 20 to 25%. It's not always the same 5 and the same 4. That I've been there for 20 years and I've never in that conference room heard a voice raised in anger. I have never in that conference room heard any member of our court say anything negative, even as a joke, about another member of the court. We get on well personally. We're professionals. We deal with the cases in front of us in a professional way. And we say what we actually think when we're in private, and we listen to what the other person says. And if we didn't listen, it wouldn't work. And that's sort of the nature of the court, if I can say that and explain that to people, and why it is that you might want to have 9 people or judges decide these issues. They may not agree, but they might listen. All that's to the good. If, in fact, it becomes a kind of cult, you have to remember that we wear black robes to symbolize, I think, that we're speaking for the law. And nobody actually cares that much. My mother might have, but she's no longer with us. What I personally do. What they care about is what the law is. And stop having the Constitution according to me or according to somebody else. Or what it matters is what the Constitution is as interpreted by the court. And so if too much publicity drives a wedge between that correct and healthy thought and the individual, that's bad. Insofar as the publicity allows the opportunity to explain to others what this institution is actually like, why it exists, and what it does, then it's all to the good.
I don't want to put a damper on that, but are you including Scalia in this?
Yes.
I'm going to ask this question because it's so poetic. I have to ask. I'm not sure exactly where you'll take this, but I can almost imagine what this questioner wants to know. What roles do the founding myths play in the United States Supreme Court jurisprudence?
The founding myths. Well, it's hard to know what is the myth and what is the
Legend.
yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think of an example of. I mean, most of us will read Gordon Wood's book on the foundings. You know, and he writes about it and describes it, and you have the Federalist Papers and.
But are you all aware of, in everything that you do, the scope and sweep of American history?
I'm not the world's expert on American history, and none of us is. And we have to be educated case by case as we are on other things. But what you do have a sense of, as you sit there, and I sit in the same, on the bench, and this is the bench where that court did desegregate the country.
Right.
They did decide Brown, and they decided quite a lot of things. And you see in front of you people of every race, religion, point of view working out their differences under law. And you think this has been going on for quite a long time. And the court has had its ups and downs. So there is a sense of responsibility that you feel stretches back to the days of John Marshall and before, John Jay. And somehow the court has helped, I think, on balance. I have to say, I think on balance, because there have been pretty bad decisions too. But on balance, I think it's helped build the nation. And you do have that sense. And you have the sense that the words that you're writing on paper are not going to last forever, but they will last for a few years. And so be careful. Be careful. And remember that this is a tradition we've inherited. It is a responsibility that somehow, there isn't one of us who doesn't realize that it's lightning striking, or we wouldn't be there. So there is a sense in which we are aware, or at least aware that we are a part of this American tradition, American institutions.
Well, here's another question that fits into that one, and then we'll say goodnight to our guest, Justice Breyer. Are we, and this person says America, quote, an experiment, she puts in quote, or he puts in quote, that can truly endure? Remember, every great, and she underlines, or he underlines great, civilization has eventually disappeared. And she reminds us about the Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians. And so are we also perhaps in that way unaware of our place in the scope of human history, and that this is an experiment that has worked beautifully for 200 some odd years, but does it have legs?
Well, it hasn't worked beautifully as I say, there have been plenty of ups and downs, and I have no doubt that eventually America will come to an end, but I don't think it's going to be for a very, 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 very long time, and we hope. And a lot of it, the way that America behaves, the way our experiment continues, a lot of it depends on us. I mean, I look over there, my grandchildren are here. It's their generation that's going to determine how they behave. And the best that I can do is what I do, what all of us do, is to try to pass on to that next generation and the generation after what we've learned from our parents, our teachers, and tried to practice throughout our lives. So if I talk to those students, I say to them, I hope that you're going to find someone to love in your life. I hope very much that you will have a successful career, and I hope that you participate in the community. Because I'll tell you, I can't tell you what to do or how to lead your life. But this document that I interpret is a document written by people who believed that you would participate in your community life. Whether in politics, whether in some form or other, they were certain that would happen. And I can tell you this, if you don't do it, this document won't work. And so I think one of the messages we can pass on, and you have to pass it on through example, as well as discussion, as well as talking. It's both, you see. That's why we like this film.
Yep.
It's not don't talk, although he says it. He says, don't talk so much. Action is important too. Quite right. And what we're talking through our deeds as well as our words is we're trying to pass on that need to participate in this democratic society. It sounds like a 4th of July speech, but my goodness, it's true. And I think it's on the truth of that that we will decide how long the country will last. I think it'll be a long time.
Before we say goodnight, thank you. Before we say goodnight to Justice Breyer, I was reminded of how you started off this evening, and you just reminded us again about the relationship between, talking, lawyerly talking, and the silent gun use of force, and what the cowboy mystique plays into that. There's a little anecdote that we should all take home with us because we saw a cowboy western. When the American Film Institute did the top 100 movie heroes of all time, I'm not going to go through the 100, but 13 was Oscar Schindler, number 3 was James Bond, number 2 was Indiana Jones, and number 1 was Atticus Finch. Now that's surprising, right? Not a very different kind of hero who was a man of words and law books. And that in many ways gives us the defining American hero, not Batman, but Atticus Finch. And we are here today with another true American legend and American hero, Justice Breyer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Film Festival continues tomorrow night. We'll hope to see you there.